The church was very active in the life of Baptist circles. From the time of their inception, as part of the Philadelphia Association. There was actually, just prior to the Revolutionary War, a fund was received to send some members of this church to petition King George about Baptist liberty. But then the war broke out and they decided that really wasn't going to be necessary, and they didn't go. A name that you may or may not be familiar with, I know the Society has worked with John Ghano and done some work there. He was a part of this congregation, but he certainly preached here and was a part of the fellowship. And when he became the pastor of the First Baptist Church in New York City, they had been kind of under watch care of this church for a number of years, and he was freely given to that ministry prior to the Revolutionary War and serving as a chaplain, perhaps some other things that you're familiar with. John Ghano and the first pastor of this church, Benjamin Miller, were involved in extensive circuit riding and mission work in the wilderness, Kentucky, Virginia, certainly through the West Virginia area down that direction, along with Peter Van Horn from the Pennapack Church in Pennsylvania.
You've heard the pastor mention several things about the first pastor, Benjamin Miller, and one of the converts that he was privileged to baptize was James Manning. And we heard this morning about Ghano, his first pastor there in Morristown, privileged to baptize Hezekiah Smith. And of course, Benjamin Miller then would baptize Manning, and of course Manning and Ghano were brother-in-laws and would preach together often. And James Manning would later move to Rhode Island after being attending the academy there at Hopewell, being taught by Isaac Eaton. He would go to Warren, Rhode Island, and there he would found the first college for the Baptist. And it would later be known as Rhode Island College, which then became later Brown University. And he was very instrumental there in helping to teach the Baptist and train those young preacher boys.
Dr. Manning's father, James, was a founding member of this congregation, dismissed from the Piscataway Church to form this church. And Dr. Manning actually, in some of his diaries, talks about coming back here to preach during the time of the British troops. This would have been when the building was out toward the north of us here a little bit. And the troops going by on Old Darby Road were so loud, the British troops, that he'd have to stop preaching and wait for them to pass until he could continue again.
And those of you who were with us on last year's tour, you remember visiting the site there in Cincinnati, where the First Baptist Church in the Great Northwest was founded, and it was founded by John Ghano's brother, his son. They would go out and help to found the church there. And you might remember the captain who led them down the river. His name was Benjamin Stites. That group of people originated here in Scotch Plains. And you'll find that Benjamin Stites, if you remember, was buried there in that graveyard on top of the hill across from the Lunkin Airport. You'll find just out here in the cemetery that his wife is buried here. So these were real pioneers, and we always saw that pioneering spirit among the Baptists, that they would go and they'd plant churches and they'd leave things that were near and dear to them, probably never to see them again. But they did it, planting churches, and God blessed. And we'll see those things out there in just a little bit.
This guy was such a famous pastor that when Abraham Marshall preached there, he stopped at this grave, recorded the fact he stopped here.
Screen from death's arrest, Miller had never lain in dust, though characters inferior must.